When you think Nintendo, one thing that probably doesn't immediately come to mind is their 2001 home console, the GameCube. Their entry in the 6th console generation fell incredibly short of really capturing the market share, or the audience, of a generation of gamers that really started to crave more mature gaming experiences around this time. Something that their direct competitors, the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox, were more than willing to offer. Hell, the GameCube was released the same year as both Halo and Grand Theft Auto 3, both of which really spearheaded gamers' demands for edgier, more mature content. The one thing that the GameCube was able to do pretty well was reinvigorate Nintendo's relationships with third-party developers that had been somewhat diminished during their time with the Nintendo 64. And one of these companies willing to play ball with Nintendo was Capcom, who in late 2002 unveiled 5 brand new games in an effort to boost sales for the machine. These games would be unofficially referred to by fans as the Capcom 5. Though if the goal of the project was to boost sales for the GameCube, then it failed spectacularly, because out of these 5 games, Killer 7 and Beautiful Joe would also see a release on the PS2, Dead Phoenix was outright cancelled, and Resident Evil 4, well, you know. Which leaves us with the only game of the 5 that would remain a GameCube exclusive, P.N.03. And yes, it's pronounced P.N.03, not P.N.03 or P.N.03, because when you start a new game, you hear this.
P.N.03.
Anyway, released in 2003, P.N.03 is a story about a mercenary named Vanessa Z. Schneider, who is sent to a robotics facility on a desert planet to quell an uprising of frenzied robots who have gone mad and are tearing the planet apart. And if that synopsis sounds even the slightest bit interesting to you, it's because I've described it in such a way to make it sound more exciting. The game barely gives you any plot or motivation, just a brief overview and you're off. And when you first start the game, one thing you'll notice is that the controls feel a little weird. It uses a very similar tank control setup to... Wow, I really suck at this game, don't I? Yeah, I'd hate to admit this, but I had to switch the game onto easy mode because I could not, for the life of me, get past the very first screen in the game. I got a game over twice just trying to get inside the facility, so if I wanted to actually see what the rest of the game was like, I had to lower the difficulty. I had no choice. The combination of trying to get used to the controls, the enemy fire getting lost among my own bullets, and some enemies straight up even having one-hit kill moves all culminated in not the best first reaction I'd ever seen. Frankly, I was starting to get the same frustration vibes I got from Never Dead, and let me tell you, that is not how you want to start your game. Trust me, this ain't it, Chief. Anyway, the controls admittedly take a little getting used to. It uses a very similar tank control setup to Resident Evil 4, where holding the control stick left or right turns you around, so running and then turning a certain direction almost feels like you're steering a car. You can sidestep left or right by using the shoulder buttons, and you'll be doing this quite a bit, as the game has a pretty large emphasis on switching between shooting and dodging enemy bullets. And it can, admittedly, look very stylish. And when the enemies are standing still, it's fine, but when they're moving, I found all of my shots missed, even with the lock-on feature. When you are finally able to get past the first screen without getting killed by the first weak robots in the game, or that one with the dickhead one-hit kill attack, you'll be greeted with a results screen that grades you on how well you did in the room you just exited. You even get a room counter telling you how many rooms are left to clear in the chapter. It grades you on things such as how many enemies you killed, how long it took you to reach the end, and how much damage you took, and you're rewarded with points. These points can be used to either buy items from the in-game shop, such as extra lives and new power armor for Vanessa, or to upgrade the stats on your current power armor. So kudos to the game for not only encouraging good play, but also making the points actually mean something instead of just seeing a number go up. You also get points for taking out multiple enemies in a row before a timer reaches 0, in what the game calls combo kills. Whatever amount of points you gain from taking out the first enemy will be multiplied for each additional robot destroyed, and using basic multiplication skills, you can gain a pretty hefty sum of points by clearing a room of enemies quickly. So get that thumb ready, because you're going to be pressing the A button a lot. Unless, of course, you have the automatic ability unlocked for your current equipped suit, at which case you can simply hold down the A button for rapid fire. But I found that the palm shots fire slightly slower than just pressing the button manually, so I just stuck with that. Each suit also has 1 or 2 special attacks that can be utilized by pressing a combination of buttons on the D-pad and pressing A in quick succession. This uses your orange energy meter, and depending on what type of attack it is, can either A, obliterate a small group of enemies, or B, do massive damage to 1 or 2 targets at a time. You'll find that each suit has 1 or 2 of these special attacks equipped to them, and if it has a second one, it will have to be unlocked by using your points. Each suit is also better equipped to handle certain situations, such as higher firepower in exchange for a weaker defense, making you having to rely more on dodging. P.N.03 relies very heavily on its shooting and dodging mechanics to carry the game's runtime. While you're not required to clear every single room of enemies to advance, there will be times where the door ahead is locked and you will have to destroy all the enemies before you can move on. But if you're after the points each enemy drops and you want to upgrade your suit or buy new ones, you'll probably just clear them all out anyway. And that's what this game boils down to. Shooting and dodging, and not really a whole lot else. No puzzles to break up the action and test your brains a little, and barely any platforming to speak of. Though, admittedly, with these controls, they make whatever small amount of platform jumping you do need to do a bit of a headache. The game doesn't really have a whole lot of verticality to speak of, but when it does, it'll usually involve either jumping or shooting enemies that are on another vertical level. The game's camera operates incrementally, and I only ever found it useful when moving it vertically. Horizontal movement just changes the angle of it to this weird 3/4 look, and I never found it useful, so I just didn't bother with it. Not that there's really anything to see anyway, because since the game takes place in one robot factory for the whole duration, all you're going to be seeing is the same sterile white hallways again and again and again. Even with 6 room designers, the game's environments hardly change at all. And while that would make sense for a robot factory to have a uniform look to it, it makes it boring as hell to explore in the context of a video game. Even worse is the fact that you will have to revisit certain areas multiple times throughout the game, even having to refight old bosses multiple times as well. And again, I get it, they're robots, they can be rebuilt, but that just ends up making the game repetitive and, frankly, pretty boring. Well then, what about the plot, you may be asking? To which I, unfortunately, have to answer with, what plot? Aside from some exposition in the beginning, and some major revelations saved for towards the end of the game, the sad fact is that there's next to no story here. Seeing the results screen after clearing each individual room was a big tip-off that the game has more of an arcade game feel to it, rather than one with a linear narrative. And I know not all games need to have gripping narratives all the time, but aside from getting a high score and upgrading the power armor, I felt next to no motivation to actually finishing this game. Aside from making this video, that is. It's also not a very long game either. When I wasn't getting my dick slammed in by the game's normal difficulty, P.N.03 took me roughly 3 hours from beginning to end. There are a few extra missions you can do to net extra points, but there are only 11 story missions in the game. 11 missions of reused rooms and 1 or 2 reused boss fights. That's not to say I wasn't having at least a little bit of fun with the game. Juggling shooting and dodging kind of made the game have a certain rhythm to it, but with no real motivation aside from upgrading my gear and, again, making this video, then the $50 American that they were charging for this game back in 2003 seems quite a bit steep, even if you are treating this like the arcade shooter that it actually is. Now, I know I front-loaded this video with all the problems I had with the game, but I really don't want to pretend like the game didn't do anything right. For starters, for a GameCube game from 2003, it does look very nice. Considering it was made from the ground up for the thing, and there were no plans for a PS2 port at the time, or at least none that I know of, they were able to take advantage of the game's slightly more powerful hardware. Granted, you'll be seeing a lot of robots in sterile hallways, but at least they're nicely rendered robots in sterile hallways. The game may only run at 30 frames per second, but I don't recall seeing any slowdown or drops in frame rate. The game does slow down when you die, but that seems more like a stylistic decision rather than an issue with performance or anything like that. The game's soundtrack is also surprisingly great. It uses a lot of techno and dance style music, and it's honestly one of the most underrated video game soundtracks I think I've ever heard. And I'm sure those of you watching might have been waiting for me to comment on this, but yes, Vanessa is hot. The game was made back during a time when you could still get away with having sexy female characters in your video games. Something that you really can't get away with doing these days. It's like against the law or something. She looks great blasting up robots and striking poses during her special attacks, and apparently none of her animations were mo-capped. So all of those movements and gyrations she's making were all animated by hand, and by 2003 standards, that's stunning. The fact that they still hold up so well today is an achievement in and of itself. It's just a shame that in order to appreciate it, you have to take your eyes off of the enemies, which isn't super feasible to do during heavy gunfights. And I think that about covers my thoughts on P.N.03. It felt like the developers kinda had an idea of what they wanted to do, but they only had time to implement and develop the bare minimum of what the game should have been. Apparently the game did fall victim to a rushed development, and it was also a critical and commercial failure the year it came out. Hell, I remember reviews for it at the time being pretty harsh. 3 separate EGM reviewers scored the game very low, and XPlay, yeah, I remember them, gave the game a 2 out of 5. And after having played it for myself, I'm inclined to agree that the game just doesn't have enough going for it. The actual amount of content you get in this game is pretty low, and even with a little more stuff unlocking after multiple playthroughs, I feel like once was enough for me. I can only imagine people in 2003 feeling a little ripped off after having spent $50 on it. Finding physical copies of it online today isn't super cheap, but it is easy enough to emulate if you have a decent computer and are extremely curious. Just know that aside from Vanessa's butt, there's not much to see here. Hey there, thanks for checking out the video. If you liked it, here's a couple more you can check out, and if you happen to like what you see and want to see more, do consider subscribing and all that happy horse shit. It's up to you though, I won't force you.